Will there be changing of attitude, say, towards Pakistan? They'll be coming down harder on the terror factories.
The Biden team sees China as a strategic competitor.
It is time to talk about what a Biden-Harris presidency means for India. Of course, I have with me HT Foreign Affairs Editor Pramit Palchaudhuri and Senior Fellow Observer Research Foundation Sushant Sareen.
See, I think one thing would be that he would be a lot more predictable, a lot less whimsical than what President Trump was. But Trump was, Trump took certain decisions at a larger strategic level, which actually worked well for us and helped us in our relations, pushing forward with our relations with the US. And I'm speaking about China, for example. Some of the steps which President Trump took did help us get closer to the Americans than would have otherwise been possible. Of course, we have to thank Xi Jinping for that as well. But I think that was something we'll have to see whether the Biden administration carries forward some of those policies, whether it's on trade, whether it's on strategic issues, whether it's on the new strategic realignments in the Indo-Pacific, or he goes back to that old template of G2 or of, trying to accommodate, trying to engage, remain very deeply engaged with the Chinese, not try and decouple the US and the Western markets from the Chinese manufacturing, not try and disrupt the supply chains which are overly dependent on China. How does that work out? I think we need to look at that. The other issue is going to be on the Western part of India or the Western side of India, where in any case, even in the Obama administration, there was very little convergence on many issues. Yes, the Americans used to pay lip service to terrorism and all of that. But in actual reality, there wasn't as much happening between India and the US as could have or should have happened. So is that going to change now? Will the Americans, after their withdrawal from Afghanistan, which seems to be inevitable, will there be changing of attitude, say, towards Pakistan? They'll be coming down harder on the terror factories in Pakistan. They'll be coming harder on Pakistan on a range of other issues. Or will they try and, in a sense, hyphenate India and Pakistan? And I think on that, some of it will be our responsibility as well, because even when the Americans try and dehyphenate India and Pakistan, you have the Indians who very often hyphenate themselves with the Pakistanis by always asking the Americans not about the big picture item, but about Pakistan. So in a sense, we also hyphenate ourselves with Pakistan. So we'll have to see, once the administration comes in place, who are the people it places in some of those pivotal positions, which actually then feed into the system. What are the kind of policies then they start taking in this area? And I think on that basis, we'll be able to say much more.
Where India needs to worry. Biden's campaign policy paper had itself said that he's disappointed by the measures, taken by, due to NRC and about Kashmir and, Article 370, his running mate, and now the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris had made, statements about what was happening in Kashmir and withdrawal of our revocation of Article 370.
I have no problems if the American administration was to raise certain issues in their interaction with their Indian counterparts and seek certain clarifications or raise certain concerns, which we can address. I think when you look at the policy paper of the Biden administration, it is very clear that he has been fed a whole lot of nonsense and misinformation, which is then gone into the policy paper. I don't know who has drafted the policy paper, but probably it's the usual suspects among the Indian American community who would have given certain things, like I said, virtue signaling. Now, if you look at the policy paper, they say denial of rights to Kashmiris. For God's sake, all the rights which every Indian citizen has have been extended to the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Where is the denial of rights? What denial of rights are they talking about? On NRC and CAA, there has been so much of disinformation. There has been so much of calumny which has been heaped, and completely misinformed, completely. And when I'll tell you this, Aditi, there was a delegation of British journalists, and nobody is more supercilious than the British when it comes to colonial, their colonial nostalgia which they have for India, and they think they can hector us, they can lecture us, they can tell us what democracy is, and all of that. And so these guys who had come, they continue to agitate about the CAA. Not one of those 15 odd journalists, not one, had actually read the act. And when we gave them the act and we told them what is your objection to the act in this, they had absolutely nothing to say. So the problem has been that even within India, there has been so much of disinformation and misinformation, and so much of conflation of things. So, for example, these British talked about so-called concentration camps. Number one, detention camps are not concentration camps. And then when you ask them that don't the British have detention camps? When you have illegal immigrants, don't you keep detention camps in Britain, in France, in the so-called civilized world? And it's fine for them to do it. It's perfectly kosher. But if India was to fight against illegal immigrants, was to have detention camps for illegal immigrants, there is a huge problem. How does that work? So I think there has to be an engagement. We'll have to explain our position to them. But what you can't fight against is a prejudged notion. What you can't fight against is a prejudiced mindset. And what you can't fight against is, this woke kind of liberalism which has started coming in many of these Western societies. You can't fight against it because there's nothing rational that you can tell them which will convince them. So on that, I think there will have to be a bit of a pushback.
But because we have a leader right now who's right of center, and that might not be the philosophy which the Biden-Harris administration might be looking at.
I don't see why Modi got along perfectly well with Barack Obama, who was further left than Biden was. Bill Clinton got perfectly along well with the Vajpayee government, which is not ideologically the same. Governments on the big, at least large countries, governments don't sit around and try to say, oh, is this leader the same ideology as I do? Because if they do, they'll get nothing done. It's as simple as that. So it's absurd to think that any government in America sitting there looking with a grid of all the ideological positions of the foreign governments. And under that argument, they could never get anything done with Japan. They could not get anything done with Britain. You would not be able to get anything done with half of Europe. You would not be able to get anything done with Brazil. And there are a lot of regimes which are far left of Biden. Biden is not a leftist under any circumstances. His legislative record is right down the middle. And so then the president of Mexico is a leftist. Biden would probably have almost as many problems with him as he would with a right-wing person ideologically. So I don't actually see this as a big issue. He'll have to make symbolic gestures to keep some of these people happy. But keep in mind, one, vice presidents, for example, do not have any influence on foreign policy at all. Zero. Biden, when he created a team of policy team to interact with the so-called progressive caucus, Sushant said the loony left of the Democratic Party, he made it clear that on they set up 6 policy teams to interact with. He said there will be no team on foreign policy between us. Foreign policy is my prerogative. The progressive caucus can stay out of that. What you can talk about is healthcare, education, immigration, so on and so forth. And the progressive caucus complained, but ultimately they had no choice. He's the president after all. He's the man that's going to be put in the White House. So I'm not overly concerned. Bill Clinton gave us as much grief. Obama gave us grief. He gave us the odd lecture on foreign policy, but it did not ultimately matter as far as the broader relationship was concerned. And more importantly, they both made it sure it did not get in the way of the larger relationship. I would also argue that for a government like Biden, what they look at is, what are my priority policies? What are the number 1, number 2, 3 things that I want to accomplish? And then they focus largely on that, and everything else is basically, how do we do these things in a manner that doesn't affect or get in the way of the main priorities? And I would argue for the Biden administration, there are broadly 3 areas in which they have a priority with India. The first one is climate. It is by far the single most important foreign policy issue for the Biden administration. They believe that Modi is a person they can work with on this issue. Modi takes climate very seriously. And they've already begun an outreach to the Indian government, even before the election results were announced, that we need to work with you and what can we do as fast as we can on climate.
Right.
Second is China. I would say that the Biden team, from what I can see and what I've read of all of his main advisors, sees China as a strategic competitor, the main strategic competitor to the United States. They differ, however, from Trump in terms of the tactics that they're prepared to use. They tend to de-emphasize the military. They tend to emphasize economics and technology. And I say, let them try. My sense is that they will fail within the first 1 year. China will immediately smell weakness and go after them. And they will be forced, as happened in the second Obama administration, to go back to a policy much closer to what Trump is about. And third, and I think this is very important because it's part of their broader strategy, they want to reduce America. They believe the American foreign policy is over-militarized. They want to reduce expenditure on defense, transfer that money to handle the really big domestic problems that they see that led to the rise of Trump. And they want to compensate for that huge cut in military expenditure that they have planned by building up the alliance structure and the strategic partnerships that America is. That the less America does on its own, the more America will require its NATO partners, its military treaty allies in Asia, and big strategic partners like Brazil and India to compensate for this. In comparison to these three very big mega themes, things like what's happening in Kashmir, Article 370, citizenship act, really are minor. And as I said, they will symbolically make noises, that's as far as I can see. But ultimately, they'll tell everybody else in their party, don't let these get in the way of the big three policies.